Hi, everyone. Today we're joined by Dr. Cecilia Orphan, Professor of Higher Education at the University of Denver's Morgridge College of Education, and a leading voice in higher education research and a major advocate for student-centered higher education. Dr. Orphan has dedicated much of her career to exploring equity and accessibility in higher education. She highlights a critical gap. Universities are excellent at recruiting international students, but the real challenge begins once they arrive on campus. She asks, are institutions truly prepared to meet international students' academic, cultural, and personal needs? We also discuss the problematic nature of university rankings, how they simplify complex educational landscapes, reinforce prestige biases, and fail to capture what really matters, the student experience. Listen on for an enlightening talk with Dr. Cecilia Orphan. Hello, Cecilia. It's wonderful to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm just going to dive right in here. We'll start out just with some personal information. You have a really, really interesting background, and I'd like us, to hear a little bit about it, particularly your educational journey, how that relates to your choice of study, going through your education, and how you've eventually ended up today in your current position. So if you can just share a bit of your background and what drove you to the field of higher education, we'll be happy to hear.
Great. And thank you for this question. It caused me to reflect quite a lot. So I'm the daughter of a woman with a third grade education and a man who took 1 year of trade school classes before dropping out to become an auto mechanic and a machinist. So in the United States context, this makes me what we call a first generation college graduate, meaning neither one of my parents went to college. I grew up working class and in deep poverty. There were times in my childhood where I didn't own shoes and I missed school for a variety of reasons. And I also experienced homelessness as a child. And I often joke that I was on the receiving end of nearly every public program and service in the United States, including welfare, housing benefits, the Pell Grant later when I went to college. And food stamps. So even though we grew up very poor and my parents were constantly just fighting to survive and worked very, very hard, they also had very high expectations for me. And specifically that I would go to college and I would have a career that was easier than the work that they did. So they had that expectation for me, but how I would fund that or even make it happen, they didn't know because they hadn't done it themselves. But they insisted that I go to college. And what's really interesting is now that I'm a professor of higher education and I know a lot about the literature and the research, one of the things that we know is that parental expectations are very influential for someone in their choice to go to college. And so that's one of the best things that parents can do is have high expectations for their students, their children. And that's what my parents had for me. So my first year of college, I attended a big state university in Oregon, Oregon State University. But I dropped out after my first year because I was working full time while going to school. I was helping take care of my siblings. And my professors and my academic advisor just didn't understand why I had to choose my courses based on what my work schedule was and my family obligations were, because they just weren't used to having students like me in their classrooms. And so I ended up transferring to a community college. I had a really wonderful experience there, and all of the professors really understood everything that I was balancing as a student. And I was surrounded by other students like myself who had many other obligations and responsibilities outside of being a college student. But I knew I wanted to get a bachelor's degree ultimately, and so I transferred once more to Portland State University in Oregon. And I really loved that university. It's what we call a regional public university. It's founded to promote access. There was a large number of first generation college students like me. And in fact, that was the first time I learned that there was something that I was called. That was the first time I encountered the term first generation college student. And my professors talked about what that meant. My advisors, the student groups that I participated in, and it helped me understand that all of the challenges I had faced to that point were not unique to me or problems inherent in me. It was just that I was a different type of student, and I hadn't yet found the university or the college that made sense for me until I got to the community college in the Portland State. And so I took 5 years to get my bachelor's degree. This is very common for first generation low income students who what the literature calls swirl, trying to find the right fit for themselves and a university or a college that fits into their lives rather than the other way. And I learned a lot about what it means to be a low income student and a first generation student through that process. So I ended up getting a job in Washington, D.C. for the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And this is a presidential association. And after about 4 years, my mentor and boss said, so when are you going to go get a PhD? And I thought, listen, I have gotten a bachelor's degree. I'm the first in my family to do that. Like, I thought I was done. And he said, well, if you want to continue in higher education, you really need a doctorate. And so he helped me navigate the process of applying for doctoral programs because, again, I was way in over my head. And I ended up getting my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a very prestigious, elite Ivy League institution. So I've had experiences at almost every type of college and university in the United States. And that was a very, very different experience than the ones I had had before that. But I was in a program that was focused on higher education as a field of study and inquiry, and really thinking about the role of higher education in society and in the lives of students. And so I chose higher education as a field of study and as a career because I believe in its transformative power. I'm a living testament to how higher education can change the course of a family. I have a daughter now and I'm pregnant as well, and my kids will go to college. They will not have to struggle the way my parents did, and we will help them make that happen. I'm already saving for my daughter's college education, and she's not even 2 years old. And so it just shows how much someone's life can change, but we still have a lot of gaps in that. And so that's something that I care a lot about, and I spend a lot of my time researching is how can we make sure that transformative experience I had is available to all students. And more recently, I've gotten very interested in the experiences of international students in the United States, partly because we are getting a lot of those students in our programs at my university. And while we have a high number of international students and we have a lot of our American students that study abroad, I don't think as an institution we are doing as well as we could to serve and support those students. So we're really good at getting them here, but once they're here, I think we're still trying to figure that out. And so again, for me, it's about that transformative possibility and power of higher education. And I think that should be available to international students as well. So that's becoming a greater focus of my work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And, your personal journey and your story is remarkable on so many levels. One of the things that comes up in my mind is your, absolutely. So this really brings me nicely into my next question, which has to do with what would constitute a quote unquote good university. And let's take the example of, Ivy League institutions, how they, how they interact with and engage international students, for instance. We encounter, hundreds of thousands now students at GradRight in the work that we're doing. And there's still very much, not still, I think it's always been and will be for some time longer, a clear preference for what is called an Ivy League institution, right? And to my own mind, there's been such a tremendous amount of really quite genius branding that has gone into this. Now, I'm not taking away from the quality of research, resources, scholarship, things like this, teaching, I'm sure. But there really is this default thinking that, this select number of universities, which happen to be the most expensive and the most difficult to get into, and probably the least likely to take that stance on international students of really wanting to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Um, I'm reminded of your TED Talk, which is viral. If anyone would like to listen, it's called "What Makes a Good College." Cecilia Orphan. Um, you discussed the difference there. If we're talking about, comparing universities or gauging the quality of universities, let's say overall, you discussed there's a difference between traditional measures of university value and the qualities that truly define a good institution. So I want to ask you, given this perspective that you present there, I'm wondering if you think that any measures of quality in higher education or any available university rankings, let's say, do they measure up in reflecting the real value that universities offer? And this is particularly in terms of student success and equity. And if you can, we can broaden it. We can broaden it a bit. I would love to know if you can share just some of your knowledge on what we can call the state of rankings today,
Mm-hmm.
including maybe positive aspects,
Mm-hmm.
and of course complexities, and of course pitfalls. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and one I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about. I think one thing before we talk about what metrics of quality we might consider when we're choosing a college is the fact that rankings systems like Times Higher Ed, like the US News and World Report, like the Shanghai ranking system, they fill a really important need because in particular for international students, there are thousands and thousands of possible colleges and universities around the world that they might want to apply for. And it is very hard to sit down and go through all of the available information about all these different colleges and universities, sort through it, assess it, and then make a decision. What the ranking systems do is they take a lot of data, and we can kind of question whether or not that data is really useful or meaningful, but they take available data and they simplify this really complex system of higher education into rank ordered choices of institutions, English systems. So that means that they're looking at metrics in English journals and publications, and that leaves out a whole host of colleges and universities whose faculty do not do research in or publish in English, but may be very high quality. The other thing that you'll notice is all of them have a reputational survey. Right. US News and World Report, this is the largest portion of their metrics. It's 20% of how they evaluate colleges and universities. And what they do is they send out surveys to college leaders to fill out and rank institutions. Just like a college student, we're now relying on these university leaders to know enough about hundreds of colleges and universities to be able to assess and rank them. And how do you think they go through that process? Well, it's likely that they're just making certain assumptions about the quality of the institution based on how famous it is. And so there was this really funny research project that was done where they sent out a survey of law schools for law school deans to rank around the United States. And they included a law school at an Ivy League university that actually doesn't have a law school. And that fictional law school ranked very high, I think in the top 10. And that tells us how faulty that measure is. And so I think when people sit down and actually look at the methodology of these ranking systems, they'll probably find that the things that matter to them aren't reflected. So the one metric that says something about the student experience is the faculty to student ratio. And there is research showing that smaller class size correlates with higher student outcomes. However, that metric can be gamed. So institutions game that metric all the time, where they'll have people with a faculty line or title in their title, but they don't actually teach classes. And so there's nowhere in the current metrics of ranking systems that most students use that help us understand what do students experience on that campus. And so the one ranking system that I like somewhat, well, there's two, but there's still issues with them. One is the Third Way, which is a think tank based in Washington D.C. here in the United States. They have a ranking system that is trying to show upward mobility for students. So, how many low-income students did these institutions accept? And how many of them graduate with higher income than they had before they started? So that speaks some to that transformational nature of higher education. One of the things we say we care about is that people go to college and they're somehow different, or they're more fully actualized afterwards, and they have higher earnings potential. Maybe they're happier, they're healthier, they're more likely to volunteer and participate in government. That kind of hints at that. The other is the Washington Monthly also has a ranking system trying to understand how colleges and universities contribute to society. So they look at things like how much do colleges spend on public service, and how many students are engaged in public service when they're students. So those give us different information, but it still is relying on data that isn't necessarily centered on the student experience. So I would say there's a really big opportunity to have more student-centered rankings systems if we are going to use rankings to help college students choose between institutions. For me, what makes a good college is one that really focuses on adapting and serving the students that they have, and understanding what those students, what their goals are, what their aspirations are, what their dreams are, and trying to help them connect their coursework, their experiences in college to those goals and aspirations. That is a really hard thing to assess. It's especially hard to assess for thousands of colleges and universities. But I think that that is the best way we can understand the value of higher education is, are students, do they feel like this is a place where they can grow and thrive, where they can make their dreams a reality, where they can achieve their goals, where they have faculty members and advisors and staff that are there helping coach them and guide them and serve as mentors and examples for them. And that's where it's a really tough nut to crack. It's really hard to get at that experience for a lot of colleges and universities. But I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, because I think it could get us closer to helping students understand what are they going to experience once they get to that college campus.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think what you're referring to is our effort towards a transparency index, essentially, a kind of benchmark that is truly student-centered, both in terms of who's reviewing this index, who's trying to gain information, make better informed decisions, and also student-centered in the sense that it is based on student input. So this is really this is a key point here, and I'm just reminded now. We had an episode with Professor Sajay Samuel from Penn State. You know him from the panel at TrustED, and we were also talking about establishing some metric for quality that is more focused, more student focused, that gives perspective, and I believe also current students a sense of how they can evaluate a university based on what an experience is actually like. And he said he thinks the system that is closest to that we have so far is Rate My Professor.
That's great.
And I love this because he said, someone's trying to make it work. And his understanding, and I've also heard it around quite a bit, that for current students, Rate My Professor is a place that
Mm-hmm.
is checked out. It's also a place to drop grievances and things like this.
Yes.
um, but it's an interesting point, and if that's what we have, then we have a lot of work to do, is what I'm
Yeah.
seeing.
But I think that the kernel of truth there is that, and this is what I always tell students when they're trying to navigate that college choice process, is talk to current students. They will tell
Yes,
you the truth that the
right.
international students themselves know. And I think that's, for us in our program, that's really important that we encourage students to share that kind of information with one another, because we do have a really big emphasis on equity and inclusion. And we just think that kind of cultural information and sharing is just really vital to the experiences that international students have.
Absolutely. It's really it's a unique kind of nurturing for incoming students. And fantastic. Thank you. Um, speaking of equity, my next question for you is, you referred in your work to the need for institutions to prioritize purpose and equity, as you've discussed a bit now, in their education strategies. Given how things are going, and in particular, which is a very hot topic for obvious reasons, we're entering into a new presidency in the US. Given how things are going as of late, and as we enter into this new phase, how do you imagine university rankings evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? Is it something that is predictable? Is it something that you have in mind? And if not, what do you hope to see? We can put it that way as well.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I actually, in preparation for our conversation, looked at the current US News and World Report metrics. I hadn't looked in a year or two. And I did notice that they updated it to include a few metrics based on the number of Pell students that the institution enrolls in. Pell grants are available to US citizens, they're for low income students. And then also, are they retaining and graduating those students? So there is something there that helps us understand some aspect of equity on the college campus. Of course, it doesn't speak at all to the experiences of other types of students, for example, students of color, international students, women, queer students who may navigate higher education and experience other forms of inequities, but it is a step in that direction. I will also say that in the United States, we're having some really important and I think long overdue conversations about the value of higher education and its return on investment. And so for a long time, it was just assumed that if you went to college, you would be better off. What we find in the United States is that many people now are going to college, but not all of them are finishing. And they are walking away without a college degree, but with a lot of debt, and because our higher education system is very expensive. And so that's caused a lot of questions about what is it that college is actually contributing to people's lives and how can we get a better sense of that. And so I know within states, there's a lot of state policy level work that's trying to understand that question of value and ROI. And I think that's going to be a focus of the federal government given student loan debt and just how massive it is. Of course, a lot of those conversations are really focused on domestic students, but I think that that kind of interrogation of value could extend or at least benefit international students in some ways, as colleges and universities are increasingly being held accountable for the experiences that they create for students.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been interesting to watch. I teach a doctoral seminar on ranking systems, and I've watched over time how US News and World Report, they're not impervious to the criticism that they receive, and they receive a lot of criticism. And they do try and update their metrics. I think part of the challenge is just data availability, and I face this in my own work when I do more quantitative research. You can desire data that speak to these different issues, but if they don't exist in a large systematic way, it's really hard to get to answer those kind of really important questions about the student experience. And so that's where there again, I think there's just an opportunity for more student focused rankings or assessments to come into play that tell us more about what students actually experience. So I'm sure US News and World Report, Times Higher Ed will make tweaks every year as they always do. What's really interesting to me, though, in studying this over a long period of time, is that those tweaks often don't change a lot. And so the institutions that are highly ranked usually are always highly ranked. And so there's something still operating there where these schools, they claim so much attention, so much fame, and other colleges and universities that probably provide pretty incredible experiences to students, their value is obscured by current ranking systems. And one of the things I wanted to mention, just in the context of US News and World Report, and I mentioned them a lot. I know it's a very US based ranking system, but it was one of the first that
Yeah.
inspired the creation of other ranking systems like Shanghai, like Times Higher Ed, that are used around the world. And it's really funny because US News and World Report was a print magazine. And in the early 1980s, they were facing budget. They came up with this idea to rank colleges and universities, and it took off and it pretty much saved that publication. So when you think about the motive of what
Yeah.
US News and World Report is, there's a clear profit motive there. And then the other thing I want to just mention in this conversation is that and this kind of touches on our earlier conversation around Ivy League institutions and their allure to international and domestic students in the
Of
United
course.
States, is that prestige has a paradoxical nature. And what I mean by that is that highly prestigious institutions, they're always going to be highly ranked. Part of that has to do with that big reputational survey and the assumption that they are good. Part of that has to do with just the enormous resource base they have. Harvard University has, I think the last time I looked at their endowment, it's $53 billion. That is larger than the gross domestic product of many countries. And so they just have a ton of resources that accrue more prestige. But with that, we have to ask ourselves, is there an incentive for them to change, to innovate, to really tune into what students want? And I will say, from my own experience at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had, in many ways, an incredible experience. I learned research skills. I got to work with leading faculty members. It having that degree on my CV meant I applied for 2 faculty jobs and I got one of them. Like, I can't overstate the benefits and privileges of a Penn education. It does exist, but I would say the quality of teaching. I had incredible teachers at the community college and the regional public. And I had exposure to incredible researchers at Penn. Were they the best teachers? I took one class with a really famous professor that never graded a single thing I turned in. So that is kind of part of it. And I think when you are so prestigious, you don't have a lot of incentives to change. So I know when I was there, and I think this still remains true, a lot of our international students that were recruited to the School of Education, their experience wasn't always the best. And
Yeah.
yet, students kept coming and Penn kept accepting them. And I think that over time they have become more aware of that and they're trying to address it. But that's where something like a transparency index and just efforts to create more awareness of that could be really helpful. I think international students are still going to want to come to Penn, but that doesn't mean Penn doesn't need to address that experience. And Penn is not alone. I think
Yeah. Yeah.
Harvard, Stanford, Michigan, all of these big name schools that are so famous and can so easily recruit students. I think they also have a lot that they could do to improve that experience for students, and they
Hmm.
should do. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We're happy to take their tuition dollars, and so we really need to think about what their experience is once they get there.
Absolutely. This really, I mean, you're just bringing to light.
Hmm.
And I'm actually thinking, I'm just going to get a little creative for a second. I'm thinking that in terms of how universities approach their students, and all the way down to how universities collect data, collate that data, and then provide that data. Also, how universities can regulate the data that is out there. I think
Yes.
it's my impression that many universities, the very positive data that's out there, whether
Yes.
it's accurate or not, they just sort of leave it there,
Yes.
and I think that's probably common. Now, if it were to be instituted across the sector, some kind of, universally identified student bill of rights. Um,
Hmm.
if you're okay with it, just we're doing the podcast thing, so if you don't mind thinking on your toes a little bit, can you imagine a world in which something like this is developed and instituted across the sector?
Yes, and I think so. Back to this idea of value. Right now, we're very focused on this tension with students paying a lot of money, and then what is the experience they have, and that's really important. I think that should be part of any student bill of rights: the recognition that this is an investment, a financial investment for most people. It is also an investment of time and intellectual capacity and their experience. And so I don't want any these conversations just to focus on the return on investment and money, as important as that is, because if we think back to kind of our lofty ideas about the purpose of higher education, again, these values around transformation, around improving society, around helping families evolve and change and adapt and feeling fulfilled in your life and being a contributing member of society. You can't place a monetary value on that, but in many ways, that is what higher education was founded to do, was to help people become self-actualized. And so any student bill of rights, I think, should touch on those financial aspects and the return on investment. Certainly, you should, for example, be better off financially than you were before. That
Mm,
is a very simple metric. It is a promise we state to students,
that's right.
and we need to interrogate if that is actually the case. But we should also think about the student's right to evolve, to change, to become fully who they were meant to be, who they want to be. What are their aspirations, their goals, and their dreams? And how does that college or university experience help them get there? I think every student has that right to have their dreams realized, to have a college experience that really supports them in identifying, clarifying their goals, and then achieving them, and has a right to faculty that care deeply about them as individuals and those goals and those hopes and those aspirations. They also have a right to attend a college that is continually thinking about the student experience and making changes as needed to improve that student experience, and that student experience is particularized so that different types of students are factored into that, and they're not just focusing on maybe the majority of students that they get, but instead they're finding ways to meet the needs of diverse students. And colleges and universities, they have a lot of intellectual wealth, they have a lot of financial wealth, and I think that they need to better leverage that to support students. And there are some that do it quite well, and often those institutions are the ones that don't rank very highly, but are doing this work every day, day in and day out, often with very few resources, because it matters, and that's their mission and that's their purpose. And they're not really concerned with being internationally famous. They're really concerned with the experiences that they create for students. So, how can we get more of that ethos and those values to spread across higher education? I do think the best way to do that is through student demand that this be true, or if
Mm,
something like a student bill of rights, that students arrive and say, these are the rights that I believe I'm entitled to. How are you going to make these rights a reality while I'm a student here paying tuition, spending my valuable time in your classrooms and in your laboratories?
I mean, thank you. I think that you've given us all an education right now, including essentially best practices rundown of how universities can improve. can improve the experiences and the relationships they have with their students, international and domestic. So thank you very much for that. So I think we'll close up here. Cecilia, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for this incredibly valuable conversation that will have its reach both for students and institutions. So thank you very much for being here.
And thank you for inviting me to participate in this important work. I'm so excited for our partnership and our continued work together.
Absolutely. Thank you.